I'm sorry? It's okay. It's okay. We will start. I want to welcome everybody. I think it's wonderful that we're here together. Forgive us for the slight delay, but welcome to everybody yet again. And for those of you who are in the room, we have a special guest this morning, and this guest is my mother, who's here from Israel, and I'm just thrilled that she's with us in person. My mother normally streams or Zooms these sessions, and now she's with us in person. What a treat. It's not often that one gets to have one's Jewish mother in the room when one is teaching. It's really how wonderful that my mother could make the trip and that she's with us in person. This in Hebrew we call a zchut. A zchut is a benefit, a privilege or a benefit. Thank you, a privilege or a benefit for which one does not have any merit to account for. In other words, a zchut is something that comes as a benefit that is without merit. So we speak about, and this is relevant to part of what we're going to talk about today, we speak about zchut avot, the merit of ancestors. That is a merit that we did not earn. It's not our merit. It is a benefit that we acquire, that we gain, that we somehow enjoy in our lives, but that is not because of something that we did. And so this, for me, is a zchut. And so, having said this, and because of a request, two requests actually that I received especially, we're going to remove ourselves from the Aleinu for a moment, and for this one session, we're going to talk about Passover and the Haggadah. And this is something that I come to with special trepidation, because you know that I can talk about very little over the length of an hour. And to speak about the Haggadah for 1 hour is really an impossible task. We are unable to speak about the Haggadah for an hour. However, what we can do is start to peel the outer layers of the Haggadah and offer ourselves some guidance and some inspiration towards the Passover that is coming up. So today we're going to speak about the Haggadah. And we're going to speak about the Haggadah in snippets, and I would like to introduce you to some of what is going on here in the Haggadah, but I would like to go straight to the core of the Haggadah. I would like to speak about the core substance of the Haggadah, and I hope in ways that maybe we have not quite experienced before, and in a way that will clarify what the Haggadah is about. Now, if you have any questions, because this is our one session about the Haggadah, I'm going to ask that you please reach out, please raise your hands, speak up, because I want to make sure that I know what the issues are as we move forward. So let's go forward with the Haggadah. You ready to do a little bit of the Haggadah today? Okay, let's move forward with the Haggadah. A few historical, chronological comments about the Haggadah. I'm going to start from the very beginning, and I'm hoping that I'm going to say things, and forgive me if I'm being controversial, forgive me if I'm being too direct. We have relatively little time. We know each other, and I'm going to be direct, and I beg your forgiveness in advance. We do not have any archaeological, historical evidence of the Exodus. not only do we not have any archaeological evidence of the Exodus, there is no written evidence in the Egyptian annals, which, by the way, exist long before the period that we attribute to the Exodus. There is no evidence of an Exodus that took place from Egypt. So not only is there no archaeological evidence, there is no written evidence with regard to the Exodus. Further, we do know that Egypt, until the first millennium, into the first millennium before the Common Era, also dominated parts of Palestine, and at certain times, the whole of Palestine, the whole of the land of Canaan. So that even if the Israelites were in Canaan, they were, without a doubt, under Egyptian domination. To begin with, this is one of those stories for which we have no archaeological or historical evidence, and yet the writing of it in the Hebrew Bible and the repetition of it in various sources of the Hebrew Bible occurs so often that scholars are unable to dismiss the story. If it were mentioned once or twice, if it were only mentioned in Deuteronomy, if it were only mentioned in Exodus, no. The story of the Exodus that we're celebrating in Passover is not only a formative story, it is a story that is already formative during the biblical period. We're going to talk about what this means. The story of our Haggadah is the story of Rabbinic Judaism. Our Haggadah starts with a temple ritual that occurred before Rabbinic Judaism ever started in the Second Temple period. The text of the Haggadah we can trace from the 2nd, 3rd centuries to the Common Era, all the way to the 15th century. In other words, the story of the Haggadah is the story of the unfolding of textual interpretation of those biblical stories within Rabbinical Judaism over a period of approximately 1,300 years. So our celebration of the Passover and our reading of the Haggadah is a celebration of Rabbinic Judaism, of our pre-modern Judaism, on the basis of a story, the roots of which are shrouded in mystery. Okay? This is the beginning. This is the very start. What sets the Haggadah apart? It is the, I'll be right with you, it is the single most concise and effective document of Jewish theology produced for home consumption. Produced for the home. This renders the Haggadah absolutely and completely unique. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about what this means in one moment. But I want you to understand the chronology here is one that, for us, the very core of the story, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet, a story that would become the single most compelling story that we would ever tell, and a foundational story for Western civilization. We're going to talk about why. We're going to see why that happens. Michael.
According to a number of modern Egyptologists and academia who study Egypt and surrounding territories at this time.
We need the mic.
I will repeat the question. I will repeat the question, yes.
The Exodus
Yes.
really happens, but not only for Jews. The roots are in fact that oppression always generate movement for escape, for freedom.
Yeah.
And according to the data that they were providing or provided in their work, that there were members of different tribes, different locations, and they got all together. One only foundation that they were against the oppression.
Yeah. So Michael, I will repeat the question. According to some Egyptologists, as scholars of ancient Egypt, according to these Egyptologists, to these scholars of ancient Egypt, there was an exodus in the sense of a movement, a large-scale movement of people, movement of populations, movement of tribes that occurred in the context of political oppression, and often, by the way, in the context of a regime change. So a number of Egyptologists, for example, point to the Hyksos period and a group of Semitic rulers effectively becoming pharaohs, becoming leaders of Egypt, and these rulers then being deposed. There are a whole number of other theories that surround this. This is very true. But an exodus of Israelites, an exodus of Semites, an exodus on religious grounds, a movement of people beyond Egypt and outside Egypt that are expelled with a military campaign and all the rest of it, we do not have. In other words, there are many hypotheses about what this could be. And there is some material suggesting that there were these mass movements of people in Egypt and beyond Egypt under Egyptian domination. But what precisely this means, we do not know. And a story like the story of our Exodus, we do not have. Yes?
Do you not agree with Richard Friedman on that Levites were the people who were in Egypt?
Very, very interesting. Richard Friedman is one of those scholars who suggested that the Levites, the priesthood, part of the Judean, part of the Israelite priesthood, is actually Egyptian inspired and actually is an Egyptian priesthood that made it, became Israelite, that effectively would become another culture. There's a great deal of writing about this. There are a whole number of different influences here. I think Friedman's writing is fascinating. I think there's a great deal to talk about with regard to Friedman's writing. I do not want to address it in detail right now, but I will say that we have to add that to the mix. It's one of those pieces of scholarship we have to add to the mix, and I don't want to respond to it in any greater detail right now. But what is so special about the Haggadah and about the story of the Exodus is that it packages for home consumption Jewish theology and Jewish ethno-national identity in one place, at one time. This is our introduction to Judaism, produced by the rabbis, for home consumption, intentionally. There is no accident here. And we're going to see it today. The rabbis made conscious decisions about the text they were going to cite, the text they were going to look at, and the way they were going to explain Jewish identity, what it means to be a Jewish religious person and a Jewish national, if you like, a member of the Jewish nation, in a way that anyone could understand, for our homes. We have no parallel to this in the whole of the rest of Jewish culture. There are rituals in the home. Shabbat, the bris, life cycle events. There are rituals in the home. Nothing like this. And by the way, surprise, surprise, it is the single most celebrated Jewish holiday during the calendar year. We're going to talk about this for a moment. And that's the core of the Passover. There are a few other elements we have to discuss here. And I'm going to go through this really quickly. The Haggadah and the Passover ritual combine ritual, home ritual, with religion. Doing and reciting. Doing and reading. Eating foods and reading. Engaging and reading. Text and action. Which brings us back to the temple period, which brings us back to the pilgrimages, which brings us back to pre-classical rituals that the rabbis now hold on to and bring back to people's homes. Now, this in and of itself is a sacrilege. In other words, this was a decision by the rabbis that required courage. And yet the rabbis understood that if we didn't do and say and read and engage all at the same time, this would not survive. There is no Passover without food. There is no Passover without ritual, in the context of which there is a particular order of actions that we undertake. It doesn't exist. It's not just reading. It's not standing up and sitting down in the chapel and chanting and reading. No. Then there is another element to our Passover and the Haggadah. The Haggadah is put together with a purpose to be a pedagogic document. This is a teaching and learning document. At every stage of the Haggadah, it's all about teaching, learning, and transmission. Here, the rabbis don't tell you, they don't say this up front, but every element of the Haggadah contains rabbinic pedagogy. Surprise, surprise, it works. Every element of the Haggadah is about transmission. It's about teaching. It's about opening the door to something else. And this moment of Passover is an especially challenging moment for us, living in predominantly Judeo-Christian societies, because there is more shared between our religion, our Judaism, and the surrounding Christianity that involves Passover, that surrounds Passover, than any other Christian holiday. We are tied at the hip with Christianity. When it comes to Passover, we share the holiday. They have Easter, we have Passover. They're calendarically linked. Christian theology is linked with Jewish theology surrounding the Passover and the moments occurring around the Passover. The texts are shared. And at the same time, at no other point in the calendar do we experience the schism between Judaism and Christianity more painfully, more clearly than we do at the moment of the Passover. No other Jewish holiday entailed the kind of violence toward Jews than the Passover in Christian lands. The blood libels often surrounded the Passover. They typically started from the Passover, and they typically surrounded the Passover. And they all had to do with the spilling of the blood of the Christ. And all the stories about Christian babies and the making of matzahs and the horrific, all surrounding the Passover. The interfaith dimensions of the Passover are not only emphasized, they're not only louder. Passover is the great moment of our interfaith challenge during the year, of our recognition of shared traditions, and of the great schism and of the great pain surrounding the Passover. And all of that is in the Haggadah. So this is my 7.5-minute introduction to the Haggadah. May we continue? Is that okay? How do we start? We're going to talk about two elements of the Haggadah, how we start and how we end. And we're going to spend a lot of time, more time, on how we start. How does the whole thing begin? Not Kadesh or Chatz, Karpas, Yahatz, not these rituals which we all know. But the question is, how does the Magid, the telling of the story, how does it start? What's taking place here in terms of the telling of the story? Do you remember? Candy anchor, full marks. How wonderful, how terrific. Avadim hayinu, right? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, right? The slavery, the notion of the slavery. The whole thing starts with slavery. We lift up the very beginning, after the Kiddush, after we wash, after the karpas, after we wash our hands, all of that, right? We come to the telling of the story, and what do? We lift. Halachma anya. Diachalu avhatana be'ara de Mitzrayim. Right? Kol dichfin yete v'yechol, kol ditzrich yete v'yifsach, hashata hacha. Right? L'shana haba. Right? This is the bread of affliction. We lift up the matzah. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Right? Anyone who needs to, come and celebrate the Passover. Right? Anyone who wishes to, come and join us. Anyone who needs to, come and celebrate the Passover. This year, we are here. This year, we are slaves. Next year, may we celebrate in Jerusalem. Next year, may we be liberated. The very first words of our telling of the story of the Haggadah relates to slavery, and in the context of that slavery, we are not redeemed. The very beginning of the Haggadah is, we are still slaves. This is our bread of affliction. Right? Followed by the Manishtana, right? The singing of the 4 questions. And then, of course, Avadim hayinu lefar'o b'mitzrayim, right? We have the 4 questions. Avadim Hayinu, the 4 sons, right? Yes. The 4 children that the Haggadah speaks about. Yes? We start out with slavery, and we at that moment are not redeemed. We're celebrating an Exodus, we're reenacting an Exodus without redemption. There's no redemption at the end of that Exodus. Right from the very beginning, here is your first theological statement about the Haggadah. We are not redeemed. By the way, the great distinction that the rabbis are making between Judaism and Christianity. Everything here is also polemical. Everything. They know exactly their environment. They know exactly where they're operating. We cannot count on redemption. There is no fast track to redemption. This is how we start. This is the very beginning. Now, the question is, where's the starting point to the Maggid? Where's the starting point? Let's take a look at this. And this really is important. Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is my Torah portion, Vaytchanan. Second Torah portion of the book of Deuteronomy. This is my bar mitzvah. Look at what the text says. When your children ask you, everything here is transmission. When your children ask you, what does all of this mean? What do all these laws and decrees and rules that our God has enjoined upon you, what does all of this mean? What do we say? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. And God freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. And there were marvelous signs and all these wonderful things that happened. God freed us from there to take us and give us the land that God had promised on oath to our ancestors, to our fathers. Yes? Okay? There was an exodus from Egypt, a removal from Egypt in order to get to that land, right? Then God commanded us to observe all of these laws at Sinai. Yes? Here is a summary of the Jewish story. Yes? This is it. In a few verses. We don't need more. Right? It will be therefore our merit, our tzedakah, before our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction that God has commanded us. This is it. This is it. Yes? God took us out of Egypt. God removed us from Egypt with great miracles to bring us to the law at Sinai, to bring us to the land that God had promised to our ancestors, to our forefathers. This is the summary of the Jewish story. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us. We should follow these laws. Yes? We read that in the Haggadah. This is Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. What we read in the Haggadah is out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Yes? This is where it comes from. But there's more. There's a little bit more. Deuteronomy chapter 26. This is Kitavo, the Torah portion of Kitavo. Deuteronomy chapter 6, it's towards the end of the chapter. It's verses 20 to 25, approximately, the end of the chapters of chapter 6. This is the beginning of Deuteronomy 26, the beginning of the Torah portion of Kitavo. When you enter the land that your God is giving you as a heritage, you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of its fruit, and you will bring it to the priest. Yes? And the question is, what happens when you bring it to the priest? What do you do when you bring it to the priest? Well, you bring it to the priest, and not only do you bring it to the priest, You have to recite something. You have to say something. There is a formula that one has to recite. You shall come before the priest, and you will give to the priest. The priest, recognizes that you've given the first fruits, and so on and so forth. And then there is the recitation. What do you say in the recitation? Arami Oved Avi. My father was a fugitive Aramean. Was that in chapter 6? My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers who sojourned there. Who was a fugitive Aramean? Who was our ancestor who was a fugitive Aramean? Abraham was a fugitive Aramean. So was Jacob, right? With Laban, the Aramean, right? Jacob was a fugitive from Aram, right? And ended up in Egypt. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Aramean line really ended with Jacob. Right? And by the way, his wives, Leah and Rachel, are Aramean. They're the daughters of Lavan, the Aramean. Yes? There they became great and a very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. Remember the story? Good. Okay, and there was all this terrible oppression, right? But God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, bringing us to this place and giving us this land of milk and honey. See the summary? And you see the slight differences in the way the story is told? We had the giving of the law in chapter 6. Here we do not have the giving of the law. We had an Aramean ancestor here. We do not have an Aramean ancestor in chapter 6. Yes, you see the differences? This too is in the Haggadah. This too is in the Haggadah. Okay, we go to the Talmud. And the rabbis ask this remarkable question. What is the beginning of our story? How does our story begin? How do we know beginnings? When does this really start? You might think this is just a technical question. It's really important. I'm going to explain it. There is debate here between two rabbis, one called Rav and the other Shmuel. In the Babylonian Talmud, you don't get two more important rabbis. These two rabbis, Rav and Shmuel, are the founders of the Talmudic tradition. 4th century to the Common Era. They are the founders. There are no two greater people in the whole of the Talmudic tradition. So when you see the names of Rav and Shmuel, you pay attention. This is important. What are we saying here? We start the Haggadah with this grace, and we end with glory. מתחילים בגנות ומסיימים בשבח. Right? We start with this grace, and we end with glory. But what is the disgrace? For one person, right, in one view, it is that we were slaves in Egypt. But for the first view, it is that we were idolaters. Now, friends, what's the difference? Why is this important? Who cares where we start to tell the story? It is a choice. Yes, it is a choice, 100%. But why is the choice important? Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We were already the descendants of Jacob. We were selected. We were chosen. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is our story. This is about our experience. This is about how we were oppressed and how we were redeemed and what then happens throughout our history. This is our story. But we were idolaters? There's a very different feeling to that. We were slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians enslaved us. We were victims. We were idolaters. What were we the victims of? The environment, ignorance. This is our choice. Yes? A little bit more. The third text. I'm going to come back to this, all being well. Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24 is yet again a product of Deuteronomist writing, and now is truly groundbreaking. This is not just about the election of Israel and the greatness of Israel and the evil of the others who oppressed Israel. Look at what it says here. Joshua here in Shechem, after everybody arrives in the land of Israel, after the crossing into the land of Israel, brings everyone together and creates a social compact. By the way, this is just a parenthetical comment. The social compact of Joshua is the model for other social pacts that are created later. You know that on the Mayflower, the pilgrims to this country created a document, a social contract. This is what it was modeled on. This is the inspiration. They were en route. This is the inspiration. There are many other historical examples. This is an American example. And here is what he says to them. In olden times, your ancestors, Terach, father of Abraham and father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. And then I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates and led him through the whole land of Canaan. And then Jacob and his children went to Egypt. And then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt, says God, and all these things that happened, right? Then God brought the sea upon them, and it covered them, the Egyptians. After the Egyptians came and fought the Israelites, and right? Then God brought the sea upon them, and it covered them. And then you lived for a long time in the wilderness. Joshua says to the people, everybody assembled. I brought you to the land of the Amorites. It belonged to other people. I destroyed them. I gave their land to you. Look at the words here. Look at what this says. I have given you land for which you did not labor, towns, homes that you did not build. You are now settled, enjoying vineyards, olive groves that you did not plant. Look at this. So I ask you the question, where do we start? Were we slaves in Egypt, the descendants of Jacob who had been blessed by God, who was selected by God, the chosen people? Yes. Are we no better than anyone else because our ancestors were idol worshippers like everybody else? We're not any different genetically from anybody else. Our ancestors are exactly like everybody else's ancestors. And we are living now on someone else's land. After everything that has happened. Are we the chosen few who were victimized, who were oppressed, who were enslaved, who prayed to God, whom God redeemed because God loves us and no one else? Or are we just like everyone else? Whose ancestors were idol worshippers like everyone else? We are the same flesh and blood as everyone else. And we went down to Egypt. And we got in trouble in Egypt. And we spent time in the wilderness. And now we live in a land that belonged to other people who have been killed. And we live in their homes and eat of their produce. Now we are in Passover. This text is in the Haggadah. Now we are starting to understand Passover. Everything. This is not just anti-Semitism, Zoya. This is the human condition. This is Passover. I want you to understand and to see this. I told you I'm going to go straight to it. I'm going to go straight to the substance, straight to the core. Everybody thinks, Passover is so happy, everything is great, and we eat and we drink, and the charoses, and everything is wonderful, and it's so great, and we celebrate redemption. This is about real life. This is about the human condition. Yes, we are here celebrating the Passover. Yes, we were redeemed from Egypt. Yes, we are the descendants of Jacob. And yes, at the same time, our ancestors were idolaters. And yes, at the same time, we went down to Egypt and we experienced the wilderness. And we now live in a land that really, think for a moment, we're not entitled to. Whoever is entitled to any land? Who said the Romans were entitled to France? Who is entitled to anything? Now, this is the core of the Haggadah. Now the question is, where does redemption come in here? How do we emerge from this human condition to experience redemption? How do we get to Jerusalem? What do we do to reach Jerusalem?
Well, you could say that Adam and Eve were entitled to the Garden of Eden before they screwed up. But I think it has something to do with covenant. I think God made a deal
God made a deal
with us.
with us. And that's what it says in the book of Joshua. And that's what it says in Kitavo in Deuteronomy 26. And that's what it says in Veit Hanan in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Just do what I ask you to do. Just fulfill your part of the covenant. Really easy, right? Very straightforward. Not quite so easy, but just do. Yes, it is part of covenant. And covenant is the way we move forward. But are we able to live up to it? Passover starts out with halachma anya. This is the bread of affliction. This year we are slaves. We are human. We are subject to our human condition. Next year, in the future, we may be liberated. We may be in a Jerusalem. We may be free. Helga.
Well, it seems to me, as you're telling it now, which is really the most wonderful way for us to understand this. God gives, can talk about redemption. God keeps giving us another chance. It's up to us to come to the plate and take it.
It is up to us to come to the plate and take. Did everybody hear that? God gives us the path. God gives us an opportunity. God has put the covenant before us, and the covenant is here. It's here for us. So it's not over. And we are here. How do I know all of this? Ellen, before I go to how I know all of this, you had a question.
Until we accept what we have been and what we are, and accept our part of the covenant, we will always be slaves in that respect. Because we can't be redeemed. Until we don't look inside, not just around, we're not going to move forward, and there will be no Jerusalem.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Until we look inward, until we truly understand and are able to look inward, as long as we continue, right? We were promised the land by God. There was a drought. God made a drought. We went to Egypt. The evil Egyptians oppressed us. It was all their fault. Yes. 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 How do I know? How do I know? A 3rd century sage, now I'm going to go back. No. What did I do here? And how do I fix it? Thank you. This is James, our miracle worker, James. Thank you, James. Here, now I'm going to try to do this. Rabban Gamliel. Here we are. Sorry. Rabban Gamliel. I know this because Rabban Gamliel, the 3rd century sage, said, whoever did not say these 3 things did not fulfill the mitzvah of the Passover. All you need to do is to say these 3 things, to understand what you are saying and to explain to yourself what you are saying. 3 words is everything is summarized in 3 words. Pesach, matzah, umaror, kol shelo amar. שלושה דברים, לא יצא ידי חובתו, right? פסח, מצה ומרור, right? Rabban Gamliel says. This, by the way, is a Mishnah, right? It is in the Talmud in Psachim 116. Why? Why, and why in this order? Pesach, matzah, umaror. Pesach, because God skipped over our homes. And where other people survived just barely or didn't survive, we came out unscathed. Pesach is, we were fortunate. We were spared. Right? Look at this. Right? Because God passed over, skipped over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt. As it is stated, and it does say that, right? We, with the sacrifice of God's paschal offering, for God passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when God smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. We were spared. How many people can you think of in your families who were not spared? We were spared. We are here. This is Pesach. Then there is Matzah. Through everything, through all the trouble, through the wilderness, through everything, somehow we were sustained. Somehow there was sustenance. Now, sometimes it wasn't great. Sometimes it was limited. But there was sustenance. We are here. We survived. It wasn't always plenty. It wasn't always the huge Thanksgiving meal. With so much turkey, we don't know what to do with it. It wasn't always with leftovers. It wasn't always luxury. But there was matzah. Do you know what matzah means? Matzah, lematzot in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, is to drink from the cup fully. In other words, to exploit fully, to extract fully. Matzah is that which is extracted in the sense of the essence that needs to be taken out. Matzah is the essence of bread. It is bread without the hot air. The yeast generate gas. They generate, right, that allows the bread to rise. Matzah is without the yeast. It's the essence of bread. It's flour and water. It's the essence of sustenance. And maror. Right? So we see the matzah, and they were thrust out of Egypt. They could not tarry, neither had prepared for themselves any victual. This is the story. maror, the bitter herbs. Because the Egyptians embittered our ancestors' lives. And they embittered their lives not just with hard work, but with hard work coupled with oppression. What is Rabban Gamliel telling us? What are the three things we absolutely must say on the Passover that are key to our Passover, without which we do not understand the Passover? Pesach, matzah, and maror. The maror remains with us. Find me a life without a hint of bitterness. Find me a life without pain. Find me a life without hurt. Show me the person. Passover is about our lives. Why in this order? Maror, the Egyptians had embittered our ancestors' lives before the Exodus. Maror should have come first. The Paschal offering came after the Exodus. Should have been maror, matzah, and then the Pesach. No. We were spared, and we are here. And we were sustained, and we are here. And we consume bitterness in our lives, and we are here. This is the essence of Passover. This is now the heart of the Haggadah. We are here. The covenant is here for us with everything, in spite of everything, and we are capable of elevation toward redemption. We are human. We are Israel. This is what we are about. This is not a children's text. This is adult material, written by people who have lived real lives, who saw everything, and who knew that we would be here talking about this. Yes? Oh boy. The last few minutes. Forgive me, I'm running over. The last few minutes. It's okay? Do you mind? Do you mind? The last few minutes. Chad Gadya. Just a few minutes. How do we end the whole of the Passover? With Chad Gadya. The last thing is Chad Gadya. The Zabin Abba Bitre Zuzei. Chad Gadya, Chad Gadya. The Father with a capital F purchased a kid, a lamb, a kid, for 2 zuzim. And the kid was eaten by a cat. And the cat was bitten by a dog, and the dog was struck by a staff, by a rod, and the staff was burnt by a fire, and the fire was put out by water, and the water was drunk by an ox, and the ox was slaughtered by the ritual slaughterer. And the ritual slaughterer was taken by the angel of death. And the angel of death was taken by God. The story of Chad Gadya is a really fascinating story. It only entered into our Haggadahs in the 15th century, and in fact into our printed Haggadahs in the 16th century. No surprise here, printing only started at the end of the 15th century, so there would be no printed Haggadah much earlier on. But it really starts in the 15th and 16th centuries. The earliest evidence we have of a song that is very similar to Chad Gadya is actually from a non-Jewish source. In Catalan, the language of the northeast of Spain. It was a popular song, and some believe, not everyone, but some believe that it was also a Christian song. But we know that it was a popular song. In fact, in the south of France, there were lullabies and children's songs that were like that kind of song. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? There are similar songs like this in other cultures as well. There are, by the way, other Aramaic versions of the Chad Gadya. I'm not going to go into the whole of the Chad Gadya. I'm not going to belabor this. But I want to speak with you about the Chad Gadya for a moment. The Chad Gadya was understood by the rabbis to be a talionic text. A talionic text. Talionic. T-A-L-I-O-N-I-C. Talion. Talionic text. A talionic text is a text in the context of which a punishment or a consequence occurs in response to a particular action. The paradigmatic talionic text that we have is eye for an eye, right? Right? This is a consequence, a punishment of taking out an eye for another person's eye. In other words, the notion of proportional action that is punishment for something that is done, for a crime that is committed, or a sin, or a transgression. Yes? However, when you look at the text carefully, there is never any causal connection between the stanzas of the Chad Gadya. The cat did not eat the Chad Gadya, the kid, because father bought it for 2 zuzim. Had father paid 3 zuzim, I think it would have been the same. Right? In other words, right, the dog did not bite the cat because the cat ate the Chad Gadya. The staff did not hit the dog because the dog bit the cat. Maybe or maybe not. We do not know. And fire burns, and water puts out fire, and oxen drink water, and slaughterers slaughter oxen. This is our life. And our life is expressed in terms of the natural world, in terms of the way we understand ourselves to be doing things in the world that lead to sometimes unforeseen consequences. or not only unforeseen, simply unpredictable consequences. And redemption from this world will only come when the Holy One, blessed be He or she or it, breaks the cycle. Breaks the cycle. In other words, the redemption of the covenant is here for us. But in the meantime, we live within the human condition. And what we have, what we hold on to, is the aspiration, the hope, the notion that we can move forward and repair and build in the context of the covenant. That is what we have here. Therefore, for this reason, when we start the Seder of the Passover, we lift up the matzah and we say, this year we are still in servitude. But next year, we may be free, we may be liberated, we may be in Jerusalem. We are here. So I want to wish you a happy Passover, an inspiring Passover, and a Passover that is real. A real Passover, wherein we really read the Haggadah. We understand what the Haggadah here is telling us. And we remain hopeful. We remain positive. We continue to aspire. We continue to work towards the covenant. Because otherwise, what is our purpose here? Otherwise, why celebrate the Passover? But this, I want you to know, beyond everything else, when you celebrate the Passover this year, please, for a moment, if you think of me, for my sake, celebrate this extraordinary text. One of a kind in our tradition that took 1,300 years to produce. A remarkable, remarkable text. Happy Passover.